Greetings all, and welcome to Lucas Brews. In today's video we're going to be doing a build and review of a vintage 1/72 scale Yak-3 from Hella. So without further ado, let's get into building this. As usual, I started off by giving all the sprues a wash off camera using some warm soapy water to remove any oil or residue from the moulding, and then I used some sprue cutters to cut out the wing halves, the seat, control column, cockpit tub, instrument panel, and the fuselage halves. I used a knife to remove some excess sprue and then glued the wing halves together and clamped them while the parts dried. I glued the control column, instrument panel and seats to the cockpit tub along with a rear bulkhead piece, and then sanded down the edges of the wings to remove any flash and mould imperfections before then gluing the cockpit assembly to the wings. While the cockpit parts dried, I cut out and assembled the propeller assembly and then began painting the cockpit and fuselage sides with Vallejo 70970 pale grey. I mixed the paint with a little bit of water before then applying it to help thin it down. Next I paint the instrument panel and the raised details in the cockpit using some Vallejo 70950 flat black. I also painted the cockpit floor and the seats Tamiya XF71 interior green, but I would later repaint them with the pale grey. For the raised trim wheel, I used a little bit of XF52 flat earth to pick out the details, and then I applied a second coat of the flat black and got out Vallejo 70997 silver and painted some raised details for the switches on the fuselage sides. Vallejo 70909 vermilion red was also used for some of the details on the fuselage side walls. This kit comes with raised surface details and panel lines, so I decided to have a go at rescribing some of them with my Tamiya scribing tool. The Yak-3 had a reputation for being poorly built during the war, with the metal panels in particular reportedly being dented and not even fitting properly on some aircraft, so I decided to try and add some nicks and dents to them by gouging some of the metal areas on the aircraft using a file and then sanding over it with some sandpaper. The results were a bit too exaggerated and not very realistic in my opinion, but it was still a fun experiment to try all the same. I finished the cockpit up by painting various raised details, including the dials on the instrument panel with Vallejo flat white, along with some vermilion red, deep sky blue and flat yellow for details based on reference photos. Some additional details were painted on the side walls and fuselage halves before the cushioning on the seat was painted Tamiya XF51 khaki drab, and the floor and seat frame were painted with pale grey. To add some internal weathering, I dabbed some XF16 flat aluminium around some of the cockpit areas to create a bit of metal chipping. I then gave the whole interior a coat of Tamiya black panel liner scent, and once that had dried, the excess panel liner was then rubbed off using some X20 enamel thinners. The thinners also helped the black panel line get into the recessed details, further highlighting the details. The fuselage halves were then glued together, which fitted pretty well, and then they were attached to the wings and the horizontal stabilizers were added. I used a knife and a scriber to cut out the holes for the radiator piece, and then glued it to the underside of the aircraft. Overall, the main parts of this kit went together easily with very few gaps or fit issues, but there were a few areas that required some cleanup, such as the radiator. I glued the main landing gear struts to the wings next, and then added some of the bulges which are attached near the radiator on the underside of the aircraft, followed by the landing gear bay doors and the wheels. The landing gear doors had quite a few separate parts to add, which were a little bit fiddly and tricky to line up in some areas, but altogether they fitted alright. With only a few small parts to add, I used some Vallejo water-based putty to fill in any gaps present on the aircraft, mainly between the wings and the fuselage, as well as the seam line between the fuselage halves and any areas where I'd made mistakes with my scribing tool. Once it had dried, I then sanded the putty until the gaps were smooth, especially on the wooden rear section of the fuselage to get rid of the seam line. For the first time, I would use this kit to try out brush painting Vallejo Model Air's Russian World War II colours, starting with the lightest colour, which was 71318 AMT7, also known as greyish blue, which was applied to the underside. The paint was given a good shake in the bottle and then squeezed out onto a plastic palette, and then I mixed a very small amount of water with the paint to help thin it down. I applied 4 coats in total of the AMT7 using a reasonably large brush and applying it in the same direction as much as possible to help reduce brush marks. The Vallejo air paints can be thinned down and cleaned with water, although they're already quite thin out of the bottle, being designed for airbrushing. After the 4th coat of blue had dried, I then applied the second lightest colour on the upper surface, which was 71304 AMT11 Blue Grey. I applied 2 coats of this in the same fashion, taking care this time to not overpaint the AMT7, especially around the tail and horizontal stabilisers. Once the second coat of AMT11 had dried, I then got out the darkest colour, which would be 71308 AMT12 Dark Grey. This time I used my brush to draw the outline of each camouflage shape first, and then I gradually filled them in, keeping the paint nice and thin to avoid creating any streaks, especially on the outlines, but not so thin that the paint would start to bleed too much. After the first layer had dried, I then did a second coat of the AMT12, following the previously done shapes, and while that dried, I painted the spinner a coat of Vallejo Vermilion Red. I continued to paint a third and fourth coat of the AMT11, followed by another coat of the AMT12 and a second coat of Vermilion Red for the spinner. I then use a small brush to do a final fifth coat of the AMT7, making sure to neaten up the edges where the camouflage colours meet each other. The scheme included in this kit is for an aircraft that's part of the 3rd Fighter Group, which was a French unit that flew the Yaks on the Eastern Front. They often had a French tricolour scheme painted on their spinners, so after the red paint dried, I then applied a white band to the front section of the spinner, and while the white dried, I painted the propeller blades and the wheels with 2 coats of flat black. The tip of the spinner was then carefully painted deep sky blue, and then I did a second coat of white to neaten things up. The blue might have been a little bit on the lighter side, but I thought that there's a good chance this colour might have faded over time, or even been a little bit non-standard in certain cases. I then cut out the decals, which were in surprisingly good shape, and then stuck them in some warm water. Once the decals had come loose from the transfer paper, I then carefully slid them onto the model using a brush, or in some cases my fingers. The arrow was included as a single decal, but I decided to cut it into sections to make it a little bit more manageable and also reduce how much of the decal film would be on the model. Once in place, the decals received some Vallejo decal softener, followed by some Tamiya decal adhesive, and then they were left to dry. I forgot to paint the rudder with the tricolour scheme earlier on, so I did this at this stage using the same colours I'd used on the spinner. I then got out some Vallejo Pale Grey and neatened up the rear cockpit area, and also painted the interior of the wheel wells with this colour. I used a fine brush to paint the yellow tips onto the propeller blades, and then I got out some Vallejo matte varnish, and after mixing it with some water, I applied it with a large brush over the entire model. The matte varnish helps to protect the decals and paint job, and also gives the aircraft a uniform finish, helping to blend the decals and the paint together. Once it had dried, I then moved on to the weathering stage. I first applied some XF52 flat earth near the walkway area to create a base for some wooden chipping, and for the metal areas on the aircraft, I used a fine brush to apply some XF16 flat aluminium and create metal chipping around the engine cowling, the metal wing root, and the landing gear. On the wooden wing area, I then applied some Vallejo natural wood grain and dark wood grain textured paints to create some wood grain effects by using a fine brush to build up several layers until I was happy with the effect. I then softened the chipping areas, first with the propeller blade by painting some flat black around the edges of the metal chipped areas. This same technique was then repeated using the AMT11 and AMT12 around both the metal and wooden chipping on the aircraft. The kit has a pretty nice canopy out of the box, but I decided for this one to experiment by creating my own vacuform canopy. This was done using my 3D printer to make a mould, and then I used a dental vacuforming machine to create the actual plastic canopy. The canopy was cut out of its sheet and the framework painted before I then cut it into 3 sections so that I could open or close the middle section for possible future stop motions. I used some rocket odorless CA glue to glue the canopy since this glue doesn't fog up clear parts, and then I filled in any gaps with some putty, which was later painted. I lost the kit's original exhausts, so I ended up designing and 3D printing my own replacements, but they did require a fair bit of cutting and filling before they could get glued into place. Once the exhausts were attached, any gaps or scratches were filled in with some putty, and then I applied some X31 titanium gold onto the exhausts as a base colour. AMT11 and AMT12 were then painted on the areas where I'd added putty, and also onto the exhaust shrouds, before I then got out some Tamiya black panel liner scent and applied it along the various panel lines, the edges of the control surfaces, heavily around the landing gear bay and on the landing gear themselves. After the panel liner had dried, I then toned down the effect using some X20 enamel thinners, and also I blended it to create both post-shading effects, as well as some grimy and dirty looking streaks, especially around the control surfaces and the landing gear. I then finished the exhausts using some rust-coloured Tamiya weathering pigment, followed by some black pigment to create the soot from the exhaust, and also some grime streaks on the underside of the aircraft, around the radiator, the landing gear bay and the control surface hinges. Once they'd been applied, I then used a damp cotton bud to soften the effects and remove some of the excess weathering powder. Finally, I then used a combination of the mud and sand powders to add a subtle layer of dirt on both the wheels and the walkway area to show that the aircraft had been operating out of some unpaved strips. The vacuform canopy had some imperfections, so I decided to try and improve it by adding some deluxe materials that looks like glass onto all of the clear sections of the frame using a brush. This somewhat helped to smooth out the surface, but I need to work on making better molds for canopies to reduce the imperfections. At this stage, I cut out and then added the last of the finer parts to the aircraft, which I'd left off till this stage to avoid damaging them during the build process. I used some AK Interactive's mega thin rubber wire to create the antenna wiring, leading from the rear canopy to the tail, which I had to tweezer and glue into place. This was a little bit of a fiddly process, but I think adding this extra wiring really added to the model. Finally, I painted the various smaller parts their camouflage colours, and after applying some XF16 flat aluminium to the pitot tube and undercarriage parts, the Hello Yak-3 was finally completed. And here you can see the final result I was able to achieve with this model. So starting off with the bad points, I probably should have puttied and filled over my attempts at the dents and imperfections on the panels. I don't think they look very realistic, and I probably won't be trying that again in the future unless I have a better technique. And although the vacuform canopy I made is nice and thin and can be in the open or closed position, unlike the kit's included single piece canopy, the layered lines from the 3D printed mold I used are clearly visible and distort the canopy. So I will be aiming to produce some smoother molds by both sanding the molds and also messing around with my print settings before I do any more canopies in the future. But on the plus side, I'm very happy with how my weathering and the Vallejo Model Air paints turned out. The paints were really great with the brush, and being quite nice and thin out of the bottle, they produced a very smooth finish without many brush strokes. I'm sure one day I'll also get to see how these paints perform using an airbrush, but until I sort out some sort of space to use one, I'll quite happily continue to brush paint with them. I've seen a lot of variation for Soviet World War II aircraft colours, and these colours seem to quite closely match a lot of darker and more greyish tones I've seen on some aircraft, so I'll definitely be using them in future Soviet aircraft builds. Although it's an old kit, I have to say I found it a rather pleasant build, with some decent details, including a little bit for the cockpit, which seemed accurate enough, and after I'd rescored those panel lines, which I admit I still need a bit more practice and patience with to get neater results, the surface detail seemed quite good to me. I was really surprised that the decals not only managed to survive with minimal discoloration, but they also responded really well to the products I used and look quite good. I'm also really happy with my exhausts that I 3D printed, and I'm kinda glad that I lost the originals, which then forced me to make them. Despite being a 1975 tooling, I would say it's still a decent, albeit very basic kit with a lot of older features, but it's still a lot of fun to build and it's nice to experiment with it. This kit has actually been reissued many times by several different brands, with the most recent one being a 2024 release from KP Models, according to Scalemates at least. So if those brands are honest and show a tooling date and are not asking for an exorbitant price for this basic little kit, I would definitely say it's still a good one and would recommend it if you want to have a simple Yak-3 or are happy to spend some extra time and money modifying it or getting some extra parts to improve its details. Thanks very much for having a watch of this video. I do hope you enjoyed it and got something out of it. If you did, please be sure to leave a like and also subscribe to the channel, as it really helps out. And if you have any questions or any suggestions on how I can improve my videos and my model making skills, please leave it down in the comments section below. A big shout out, as always, to my wonderful patrons for helping me fund not only buying the kits that I use to make my videos, but also the products that I use to make them. This was a smaller kit which I'd been working on for a little while, just as a sort of side build for when I was doing the more difficult High Plains Beaufort and that sort of thing. But I will be getting back on track with doing build videos for some of the kits that I've previously done inbox reviews for. And if all things are going well, then this week I should also have a inbox review for the Eduard BF109 G5 and G6. So stay tuned for that. And of course, as always, take care, and until the next video, model on.